Hello everybody, my name is Boulevard, and 2023 is finally over, which means it's time to look at the year as a whole as it pertains to competitive Legends of Runeterra. I've been teasing at this video a little bit on Twitter, dropping stats here and there. It's time to fully dive into the year in review. So I wanted to kick things off on my raw data sheet to give you an idea of what we're looking at here, the context for the data in this video. We had 13 events in 2023. We had the World Ender Seasonal, the 4 events in Glory and Navori, 3 for Heart of the Huntress, 3 for Fate's Voyage Onward, the Last Chance Qualifier, and the World Championship. This gave us 37 winners for a total of 111 deck lists, and we are just looking at what won these events for the context of this video. Now you'll notice a couple of these lineups are highlighted in yellow. 5, in fact, of the 37, because these are the only lineups throughout the year that won an event that did not have an overlap of regions in their lineup. So 5 out of 37 players were able to win an event without using the same region twice. Now, with a little bit of a caveat in there, because Jax Varus is Runeterra, but that doesn't feel like there's no Runeterra elsewhere in the lineup. So for the context of this, I view Runeterra like Jax Varus as not repeating the Runeterra region, because I think even if you were to play a region locked competitive format, you would allow players to play double Runeterra decks. While I've still got you here, though, there's one stat that I couldn't really figure out a clean place to put in the video, so I'm going to throw it at you now, which is that heading into the World Championship, I talked about how everyone who got second place at a Worlds qualifier still made it to the World Championship. However, there were 7 Runeterra Open winners that did not make it to the World Championship. And what is interesting is that 3 of them came from the Heart of the Huntress Open. Nobody who won the Heart of the Huntress Runeterra Open made it to the World Championship. And this is an important reminder that the stats aren't something that you can gridlock on. You can't look at this and go, oh, Siren Song meta was so dead that, brain dead players could win it and they didn't make it to Worlds because they suck otherwise. That is absolutely not the case. AM was won by Ian Aguera, EMEA was won by Ragnar Osick from the 2021 World Championship, and APAC was won by what translated as Legal Cancer. And when we look at the runner-ups, like Grandpa Roji got second place in the Americas, KDF Reroll got second place in APAC, neither of EMEA's finalists made it, but it was a hard-to-ignore statistic that all 3 winners of the same Runeterra Open did not make it to the World Championship. I literally don't mean anything by this, I just thought that was an interesting stat. So, now you have that too. But now it's time to get into the cool stuff. Let's talk about the best decks of 2023 by the numbers. I will get into the full breakdown here in a little bit, but I wanted to beautify things a little bit for our top 8. And it was a really nice, clean top 8 cutoff. Everything underneath of elusives only won 3 events this year. So, how do we read this? Karma Set won 8 events this year. There were 13 unique events this year, but there were 37 events, right? Because the 12 unique events leading into Worlds were each played on 3 shards. That is what Karma Set won 8 of. However, it did win 7 of those 13 unique events as well. It only had 1 overlapping winner. And Karma Set is a really flexible option as well. It won 5 standard events and 3 eternal events, so good diversity between the formats. It had early year wins, it had late year wins, diversity across the board. And of course, did it with 3 different region combinations, Targon, Shadow Isle, and Piltover and Zon. It wasn't just always IO, P, and Z. We had a little bit of diversity in there as well. So I think Karma Set is a great representation to be the #1 deck of 2023. And of course, right behind it, we have Jax Ornn, which got 7 of those 37 wins, 6 of those 13 unique wins, so coming in just behind it in terms of that, just under 50% of the unique event wins for the year. And Jax Ornn had it a little bit rougher than Karma Set did. Jax Ornn had to compete with timelines a little bit. Karma Set does have to compete with Pursuit Seraphine, so it's not like either of these are just iron locked on, oh, this is the only way to play this deck. Earlier on in the year, Jax timelines existed, Ornn would get played in Trundle timelines from time to time, and ultimately it was just not the best deck for either of these players or either of these champions in Eternal. That said, did still win 4 standard events and 2 Eternal events, so as timelines got nerfed, eventually Jax Ornn did start to rise up a little bit more. But let's talk about the #3 deck. Plaza Guardian Seraphine. This is Samira Seraphine, for those of you that remember, and it's an Eternal-only deck, so to see it break into the top 3 is either really cool or really damning, depending on who you ask. It is a little bit rough that there were only 4 Eternal events for the year, because World Ender kind of counts, but because it was played with Eternal champions and things like that, but it was pre-rotation, so that's a little confusing. But Plaza Guardian Seraphine, of those 4 unique Eternal events that we had, Plaza Guardian Seraphine actually did win 3 of them, and it's pretty different from Pursuit Seraphine. And yeah, maybe you could make an argument that I should have just lumped all of the Seraphine decks together, but I don't know. PG Seraphine and Pursuit Seraphine felt different enough to me that I just wanted to list them out separately. And it's not like a standard versus Eternal thing, because if I wanted to put Eternal Seraphine, then one of the Pursuits would have been there as well, is kind of the point that I was getting at here. But 6 and 5 for those. It was actually Ionia Seraphine actually only won one event this year. It won twice at that event, but then, of course, so the breakdown of Pursuit Seraphine, that one Targon Eternal event, 2 Ionia Seraphines that won the same event, and then Boxer with Shadow Isle Seraphine twice. That's your Pursuit Seraphine breakdown. And then we just have 4 very straightforward decks. Well, 3 very straightforward decks that won 4 times. We had Echo Jinx, Samira Fizz, and Neela Janna. If I remember correctly, I think Echo Jinx actually won the first 3 APAC events of the year. Yeah, it won at the World Ender Seasonal, the Glory Navori Open, and the Glory Navori Worlds Qualifier. So like all of the Echo Jinx wins came incredibly early because the 4th one was also EMEA at the Worlds Qualifier for Glory Navori. So very early wins from Echo Jinx, but like just such a solid option that it was able to maintain its top 8 leaderboard position throughout the year, despite more things coming out and being able to overtake it. Samira Fizz, again, like a short-lived run, but a dominant one, just like Echo Jinx. And then Neela Janna, again, kind of a short-lived run. This one much more at the end of the year as opposed to the beginning of the year. But again, just like these decks were so dominant in the moment that they came out, and then they lasted for a little bit more than one event, right? Because if you were only around for one event like Siren Song, then you could only get 3 of these wins. So they did have a little bit of longevity as compared to something like that. And then Elusives, the breakdown for this, 2 of them were Bandle City, Piltover, and Zon, Teemo Yumi. One was Fizz Yumi, Freljord Bandle City, and one was Zoe, just mono Zoe, Targon, Piltover, and Zon from one of the first Eternal Opens. But yeah, that's our top 8. Let's take a look at the full breakdown. Okay, so here we are at the full breakdown. Now, there's some cool stuff in here. You can start to see the things that are underneath of our top 8. We can scroll down a little bit, just give you a view of everything that won. Remind you that, like, Puff Caps and Rise and Deep won events this year if you needed to be a little upset. But what's really interesting are things like Invoke and Timelines, which are a little bit hard to classify in that. So if you were to look at a full breakdown of decks that won, Timelines would be up there 5 times. But when you look at event wins, Timelines is only up there twice because one of the events, Timelines won with triple Timelines, and once it won with double Timelines. So putting a little asterisk next to it sort of here in the notes section was the best that I could do. And Invoke, one of the players played double Invoke. So just something to point out, a cool little fact, like, didn't win 5 events, but did have 5 decks win, because it was like triple Timelines in EMEA and Eternal, and then double Timelines in like APAC at the next event or something along those lines. But the one that I really want to talk about are these decks that are highlighted in yellow. So what's special about these is that all 3 winners from each different shard won the event playing the same deck. So at the Glory Navori Worlds Qualifier, all 3 players from AM, EMEA, and APAC were playing Samira Fizz when they won that event. World Ender Seasonal, we had Pantheon Varus Aphelios. Heart of the Huntress Open, we had Siren Song Champion Strength, and that was the only version of Siren Song Champion Strength that was won by all 3 players. A little bit of a different approach in, I think, APAC and EMEA. And then Invoke at the Heart of the Huntress Eternal. So 2 of these happened in Eternal events because technically the World Ender Seasonal was Eternal because it was like Aphelios won. So, that's like an Eternal champion. But yeah, it was really cool to see that only 4 decks had that dominating presence to do it that one time and get all 3 players to win with that singular deck. And now Samira Fizz has been like, nuked out of orbit. Pantheon hasn't seen the light of day in a while. Aphelios is still doing stuff, but like Pantheon's just gone. Siren Song obviously got kneecapped, and then the same thing happened to Invoke. So like these decks got dealt with. But I am curious to see if we can top this next year, if we'll have more of a homogenized top end meta where like players are constantly winning with the same decks, because 4 I think is a little bit lower than I might have expected in terms of like, yeah, all 3 players from this event won with the same deck. I don't think we had anyone ever win with the same lineup. I'd have to dig into that one a little bit more. Off the top of my head, I would say that no, we didn't have any like all 3 players won with, or even 2 players winning with the same lineup, I don't think. But yeah, just wanted to shout out these 4 decks for being very dominant on their specific event. Now that we've taken a look at the decks that performed well throughout the year, let's zoom in a little bit and go event by event. So as you can see, this is a color-coded mess that I promise I will explain. There's a little key up here, but don't worry, I will go over it. Again, I do not have global top cut information for the World Ender or Glory and Navori Open. I do have I have the winner and the runner-up from EMEA and APAC, but I only have full information for AM. So we're kind of going to gloss over these 2 events. But the one thing I did want to point out is that all 3 players that won the World Ender Seasonal played Pantheon Varus Aphelios. 2 of the players that won played Conservatory, and this was pre-rotation, so this was Bilgewater Noxus. This was some combination of Annie, Katarina, and Twisted Fate. Then at the Glory and Navori Open, 2 of the winners played Noxus Leona. All 3 of the players didn't share a deck. That's how we read that, right? Let's get into the stuff that we have global information for that we can talk about. So, the top 3 decks from this event were Bandle Gunners, Samira Fizz, and Echo Jinx. The way to read this, the yellow means that for each shard, Bandle Gunners was the number 1 deck. For each shard, Samira Fizz was the number 1 deck, or the number 2 deck rather, going in order. And then Echo Jinx globally averaged out to be the number 3 deck, but it was only the actual number 3 deck for EMEA. Does that make sense? So like Americas might have had like, I don't know, Aatrox Vayne, and then like APAC might have had like Jax Ornn as their number 3 decks, but like when we average it out over the whole, Echo Jinx comes in at number 3, and it was also happened to be the number 3 for EMEA. Then when we look at the highest representation of an individual turnout, EMEA had 42 Bandle Gunners, and that was the highest number of Bandle Gunners in a specific tournament. 35 Samira Fizz, again, the highest number, again, going to EMEA. And then, of course, had the highest Echo Jinx representation because it was the only one where it charted at 21. Then we have the global total here, so like 114. And you can kind of look at these numbers against the other events to get an idea of like what we should be looking at. There are a couple of events where things went over 100, and then usually it was a pretty big fall off if they didn't make 100. Like we have some 60s, we have some 40s, we have like 190, maybe 290s. So for the most part, you're looking at around 100 for your number 1 deck, 90 to 100 if you have a pretty clear best deck, right? So gonna skip over these numbers a little bit just because the global totals aren't as interesting. But again, all 3 players from this event won with Samira Fizz, 2 of them won with Echo Jinx, and 2 of them won with Karma Set. At the Gloria Nevoria Eternal Open, again, Plaza Guardian, the number 1 deck across all 3 shards, Jax Ornn, the number 2 deck across all shards, and Timeline's the number 3 deck on average, but specifically the number 3 deck in APAC. Again, EMEA had the highest representation for their number 1 and 2 decks, and then APAC had the highest representation of Timelines. Again, not quite actually breaking into the hundreds here with the Plaza Guardian, which is a little surprising given that APAC had a little bit more than, or EMEA rather, had a little bit more than half of their players on it. But again, 2 of the players did win this event with Plaza Guardian. Then we get into the second open. Again, Plaza Guardian, the number 1 deck across all 3 shards, now getting up to 100 from 90 on the previous one. Timeline's the number 2 deck for all 3 shards, and Tristana Atrocity was the number 3 deck for 2 of the shards. I don't remember which, probably AM and something else. And again, how we read this, EMEA had the highest Plaza Guardian representation, APAC had the highest Timelines representation, and Americas had the highest Tristana Atrocity representation, with Plaza Guardian and Tristana Atrocity being in 2 of the winners lineups. Are we starting to get how the color coding and the keying works here? I'll keep walking you through it, don't worry. Heart of the Huntress Open. Reaver's Row Zolani was the number 1 deck for all 3 shards. Reaver's Row Champion Strength, the number 2 deck for all 3 shards. And Jax Ornn was the number 3 deck for 2 of the shards. And the Americas had the highest representation of all of these decks individually. And then Siren Song Champion Strength becomes our 2nd deck of the year to dominate and be won by all 3 shards. And Siren Song Zolani was in 2 of the winning lineups from this event. Then we go straight from the Siren Song meta to the old meta, where Jace Heimerdinger was the number 1 deck in only 2 of the shards. Aatrox Vayne was not the number 2 deck on any shard, and that is what the purple means here. However, when you average out all of the shards together, it is the number 2 deck. And what's really interesting is, like, you can actually see this is one of the instances where the number 2 deck was higher than number 1 because it was the number 1 deck in the Americas, right? Again, it's not number 2 on any shard, but it was number 1 in the Americas, which is why it has a higher number than the number 1 deck from EMEA. Does that make sense? And then Nasus was the number 3 deck in APAC and, of course, globally when averaged out. But it was actually EMEA that had the highest representation of Nasus because I think it was their number 2 deck, and that's why, again, Aatrox Vayne wasn't the number 2 deck for any region. Again, we can see like very low numbers here. 67 for our number 1 deck, not quite the lowest on the year, but not too far off. Worlds doesn't really count, so yeah, the 2nd lowest next to, I believe, the LCQ, which was a very diverse meta. And then it was Ionia Seraphine and Jax Varus that won 2 of the events here. Heart of the Huntress Eternal, Invoke sweeps, Shadow Isle Warden sweeps for the number 1 and 2 spots, and then Timelines comes in at a close 3rd for a couple of shards. Then we had 51 Invoke in the Americas, because again, the way that I classify Invoke is if Mountain Scryers are in your deck, you are an Invoke deck. Epiphany, if you're in there, as long as Mountain Scryers are in there, you're still classified under Invoke in my book, and that's why it blows everybody else out of the water with 142, the highest represented deck for the year. And even behind that, with just Shadow Isle Warden, probably the highest for like an individual build at 113. I don't think, okay, Bandle Gunners, but even Bandle Gunners here was like Demacia and Bilgewater and maybe like 1 Noxus player that was still playing Might. So yeah, SI Warden definitely got up there in that Eternal format, and then Timeline's just still surviving in the Eternal format as it does. Can see here, America's brought the most Invoke, EMEA brought the most Shadow Isle Warden, and APAC brought the most Timelines. Invoke won all 3 shards, while Warden and Plaza Guardian still won 2 of the shards. So this was probably like one of the most homogenized events that we had. Then we get to the Fates Voyage Onward Open. Here's where things get interesting. This is the only event that was won by 9 unique decks. There were no overlapping decks amongst the winners, and that's why this is all purple. But Warden was still the number 1 deck for all 3 shards, with AM bringing the most of it. Jax Ornn, the number 2 deck for you know, globally, but specifically for EMEA. So like EMEA had like Warden number 1, Jaxor number 2, Neogiana number 3, and that is how things averaged out globally. And then AM and APAC had different number 2 and 3 decks, but everybody was on the same page about Warden. And I think Neogiana was actually number 2 in APAC, and that's why they have a higher representation than EMEA did. And again, a nice little healthy spread over here. Worlds qualifier, everybody is on board. And this was a really funny one because everybody brought 36 Neogiana. Everyone was just super on the same page at this event. Every shard brought 36 Neogiana. And I think that's the only time we actually have like yellow or orange here on the representation, like where we had a global tie. Then Formidable and Scouts at 2 of those shards for the number 2 and number 3 deck, with EMEA being one of those each, because that is why they have the highest representation there. Then Neogiana and Formidable actually doubling up and getting a win for each of these players. I don't think Scouts actually won an event all year. Then the last Eternal format. We get Jaxorn and Targon Victor at the number 1 and 2 spot globally. And then this was a really weird one where Nasus and PNG Fire Spitter had a global tie of 41. So across all 3 shards, there were 41 PNZ Fire Spitter and 41 Nasus. But these were not the number 3 deck for any shard. Nasus was the 4th deck in every shard, but because their number 3s were so scattered, globally averaged out, Nasus gets in on number 3. And then PNZ Fire Spitter was 5th in the Americas, 2nd in the EMEA, and 5th in APAC, with EMEA having the highest representation of each, the Nasus and PNZ Fire Spitter. So I thought that was sort of another interesting one. Again, not too much to like actually garner out of that. And then when we look at what won, Jaxorn, Titanic, and Karma Set were won on 2 shards each. Probably one of the more homogenized metas, especially when we look at Eternal. No, Eternal tends to, I guess, just look like this, right? Because we had Invoke, then Warden, Plaza Guardian. So this was probably the least amount of unique decks that we had win an event. And then again here, everybody's running 2 of the same thing, so I think it's like 6 decks that end up winning instead of 9, which, yeah, I guess that's just kind of what Eternal looked like this year. It was pretty homogenized across the board. Then we get into the LCQ. Jaxorn's the number 1 for everybody. Karma Set and Bandle City Jinx are the number 2 for a couple of shards, and Poros is actually the only overlapping win for LCQ players. And then, of course, Worlds, like, it's a, you know, it's not a shard-by-shard event, but I did want to point out that, EMEA had the highest representation for Respect Your Elders. 17 of their players brought it, but there were 42 total. Americas brought the most Inquisitor Mordekaiser and the most Karma Set. You can see that they were almost half of the Inquisitor Mordekaiser. They were 16 of the 36, and then about a third of the Karma Set, whereas EMEA was like maybe you know, a little bit less than half of the Respect Your Elders. But yeah, that is how we read this chart. And I hope that was just kind of cool for you. That's just what this is, right? We're just showing off cool stats for the year. So now let's take a look at regions on the year. I know that my camera's covering things a little bit. This is like the cleanest way that I could try to present this information. I'm sorry, I am limited to my just capacities as a human. But the one thing that I think you're all the most interested in is the yearly stats. Of the 111 decks that we had win events this year, 46 of them were Piltover and Zon, 31 Runeterra, 25 Noxus, 22 Targon, 21 Freljord, 17 Bilgewater. Targon actually barely beating out Freljord in the final hour thanks to Talpinator and their Morgana Riven. It was a tie previously. Then Bilgewater, Bandle City, Shadow Isle, Demacia, Ionia, and Shurima. Now you can fend for yourself on how fair you think these numbers are, if a big drop-off occurs, because like they're pretty close, right? Like PNZ dominated, and then Runeterra is like barely ahead of the sort of average of like near the 20s that we were kind of looking at. Noxus is a little high, but I think that was mostly like Samira dominance very early on in the year. Targon always got a big bump in Eternal, so like if we looked at Standard, these numbers would probably look pretty different. And then we just kind of like get down into the teens, and then Shurima just has a really rough time, because I know that it says 7 Shurima. I do want to remind you that Echo Jinx won 4 events at the beginning of the year. So there were only 3 Shurima decks that were not Echo Jinx that won events this year, which is not a lot. If I remember correctly off the top of my head, it was Talia Malphite. It was, so 4 Echo Jinx, then Talia Malphite, and then Nasus and Ambush. And I want to say like almost all of those were in APAC as well. APAC was like the Shurima shard this year. So yeah, that's the yearly stats. And then when we look at how they combined with other regions, so like the number 1 region combination for the year was Piltover and Zon Noxus. Piltover and Zon Noxus decks won 9 events. The number 2 one was Ionia Piltover and Zon. Unsurprisingly, this is mostly Seraphine and Karma Set, and that won 8 events. And then Targon Piltover and Zon won 7 events. And, you know, that was pretty much mostly like the value Targon PNZ stuff. It was also elusives at one point. There was a little bit of diversity in how like PNZ Targon did things, and then there was actually a tie as well where Freljord Runeterra, that's Jax Orin, tied with Targon, Piltover, and Zon at the number 3 spot. So that is how you read this chart. And again, we'll go over like the number 1 combination. So like PNZ Noxus, the number 1 combination there, Freljord Runeterra. Bandle City was paired with, unsurprisingly, PNZ most often, and then a pretty hard fall off. PNZ had a little, or Bandle City rather, had a little bit of a rough year. Noxus, PNZ, and then Bilgewater and Targon actually as well, thanks to Noxus Leona mostly. I think this was like 4 Noxus Leona, and then 3 or 4 Noxus Leona, and then like Riven Morgana. Bilgewater Noxus, Conservatory did pretty well at the start of the year, and then of course Samira Fizz. Shadow Isle Freljord actually still made the number 1 spot, even though Shadow Isle was like talked about with Nasus a lot throughout the year. We only had a couple of Tristana wins in Shadow Isle, but yeah, Shadow Isle Freljord, like War Mothers having that late stage comeback really helped boost these numbers, or even like if you didn't run War Mothers and just like the Titanic players that we had, which is basically War Mothers without War Mothers. Then Targon obviously as PNZ, and then Targon Runeterra, because this was the Pantheon Varus, got 3 of these at the very beginning of the year, so that's why that number looks so high. Runeterra Freljord, Jax Orin, and then Freljord Shadow Isle we talked about. Shurima, like I mentioned, it's the Echo Jinx show over in Shurima right now. The loss of Absolver hurt that deck, but it hurt everyone else just a lot more, I guess. Ionia is all PNZ, baby. And then you know, Shadow Isle, that's Karma Set. Targon, that's Karma Set. Noxus, that was Wildfire. And Runeterra, what was the Ionia Runeterra deck? I don't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, it's mostly just Karma Set over here in Ionia. And that's why Ionia is like so low down here on the yearly representation. And then Demacia had a pretty healthy split. You know, Runeterra Demacia, that was like Bard Garen, that was Aatrox Vayne. Freljord Demacia, like Formidables, had a really big bump at the end of the year. Bilgewater, this wasn't Scouts. I don't think, yeah, if I remember correctly, Scouts didn't win an event. I don't know. We'll get into that when we get into the champions. I don't want to just, I don't want to look at 3 Demacia Bilgewater and be like, yeah, it was never Scouts. There was always something else, because I don't actually know what else it would be. So maybe it was Scouts. We'll find out in a moment here, though. And then Demacia PNZ. This was not Jace Lux, though. This was Janna Champion Strength. The Janna Teemo list that like AJ the Pro won with, and then someone, I think an APAC player at the next event played it as well and won with it, or maybe AJ won with it twice. I don't remember. I feel like it was an APAC player that took it and ran with it. It might have even been EMEA, but I don't think it was AJ twice with Janna CS. But yeah, this was not Jace Lux, this was Janna CS. So that is your region breakdown, and then something that we've got over here is the repeats. So I mentioned earlier about how only 5 of the 37 lineups that won on the year did not repeat regions at all. So when we look at what they did overlap on, there were 9 times that players won using Piltover and Zon multiple times, and of those 9 times, 4 of them were triple Piltover and Zon. In fact, one of the things that I think I failed to mention earlier is that when we talk about like 9x lineups, like 9x Timelines, 9x Warden, stuff like that, only 2 9x lineups won events this year. We had 9x Timelines and we had 9x Siren Song in the Americas with Ian Aguera. So only 2 of the 37 events were won by 9x lineups, but we did have 4 triple PNZ lineups win this year. Freljord and Runeterra overlapped quite a bit. Then Targon, Bilgewater, Bandle City, Demacia, Ionia. Shurima and Shadow Isle never made it into the lineup twice of a winning player, which makes sense when, you know, Shurima, again, was mostly just Echo Jinx, and Shadow Isle was mostly just Freljord and a couple of other things. But, you know, Mordekaiser was only out for 1 event this year, and it didn't win Worlds, so, like, that is just something that you're going to have to think about heading into 2024, is that, like, Shadow Isle does now have, like, a very powerful champion, and I'm sure we'll get these numbers up. Well, maybe not, actually, because you can only run 1 Mordekaiser deck, so maybe we won't get these numbers up. RIP Shadow Isle. But again, just want to reiterate, this is not a clickbait title. Like, very much the year of Piltover and Zon, right? Far and away the most winning region, with 15 being the gap between it and number 2. And Runeterra had an advantage of, like, Runeterra decks existing. And then when we look at repeats, like, the only region to be repeated, like, 3 times in the same lineup, and it did that almost half the time that it was the repeated region. It's absolutely insane year for Piltover and Zon. And before we move on from regions, I actually did want to talk about the shard by shard breakdown for each region so that you can get an idea of which shards were inclined towards what. So for Piltover and Zon, while it was the number 1 region throughout the year, it was actually not the number 1 region in the Americas. We were more inclined towards Runeterra, with Piltover and Zon coming in just behind that for us. But again, EMEA just like hard going all in on PNZ. APAC very up there as well, the only one in APAC to make double digits. And so that is where this sort of number comes from, right? So you can kind of take in this chart for yourself. The highlights that I have here is like the highlighted one is not necessarily the highest and lowest for the shard. That is how it works out for the Americas, but it is rather the outlier in that the Americas was like pretty high on Runeterra, especially as compared to APAC. Like APAC was comparatively pretty low on Runeterra throughout the year. EMEA huge on Bandle City, right? We got 339, like half of the, more than half. What is this, 2/3? Yeah, something like 2/3 of the Bandle City decks that won this year were EMEA. EMEA loves Bandle City, and they hate Ionia. They're the lowest represented Ionia. They got hard carried by the rest of the, like, 12 Ionia decks throughout the year. 2 of them were EMEA. That's it. And then 0 Shurima for the Americas is a big one. 5 Shurima for APAC. Like I said, I think APAC won with, like, most of the Shurima decks, and they did start off the year with 3 Echo Jinx wins. So, like, one of the wins over here for EMEA is Echo Jinx. And then the other one, you know, the other decks are, like, Ambush and Nasus one time. I don't remember which shard they were exactly. But, yeah, did want to highlight that, like, America's actually won with 0 Shurima this year, which I think is wild that, like, any of these hit 0. So what we're really looking for going into 2024 is, like, shore up Shurima a little bit, take down PNZ a little bit. Like, I think that's kind of fair. Runeterra, you know, was pretty strong, but it was also the year that, like, Runeterra cards were coming out a lot. So it makes sense that they got a lot of wins. But PNZ, like, they got Janna at, like, the ass end of the year. So Piltover and Zon probably shouldn't have been as strong as it was for as long as it was, but that's you know, that's just something to look at going into 2024. Okay, so for this section, what I want to do is talk about sort of the losers of the year, go region by region, and show you which champions failed to win an event. Now, there are a couple of caveats here. Number one, for Bandle City champions, I counted them as whatever region they are that is not Bandle City. So as you can see, like, Heimerdinger here is represented under Piltover and Zon, so is Teemo. When it comes to Bandle City, we will just be talking about Nora and Tristana. Mordekaiser counts for Shadow Isle, because every Mordekaiser deck is Shadow Isle, and Morgana is actually going to count for Targon rather than Demacia, because in the event that she won this year, Worlds, she was a Targon champion, not a Demacia champion. So when we look at Piltover and Zon, each champion was able to find a win here, except for Heimerdinger and Jace, which I think is actually pretty funny, because Heimer and Jace was such a long-standing deck for the year and kind of got nerfed for being a long-standing deck, and are still the only 2 champions in PNZ that did not manage to secure a victory. When we look at Runeterra, so this graphic cuts off the Poro King, Aatrox, and the Elder Dragon, but it doesn't matter because Nico is the only Runeterra champion that was not able to win an event. And we're only looking at standard for this, just so that we're all clear. There are some stats that we'll look at with Eternal champions later, but for now I just want to focus on standard for something this specific. When we look at Noxus, they actually had a really good year. Again, Mordekaiser, we are not counting for Noxus, we are counting Mordekaiser for Shadow Isle, and I just wanted to avoid double ups. But LeBlanc is actually the only Noxus champion that did not win an event in standard, which, you know, maybe that surprises you, maybe it doesn't. Well, okay, so Sion won an Eternal event, but Sion is a standard champion and did win an event. So, like, that is how we are classifying that. Sion did win an event. It might not have been a standard event, but Sion is a standard champion and they did win an event. Make sense? Getting into Targon, actually, Aurelion Sol is the only one that didn't. I know you might be looking at this like, well, I don't remember, you know, all these champions. Let me break it down for you. Talia Malphite won an event very early on in the year. Kayle was part of Noxus Leona. And then Diana was part of the Siren Song meta, and from there, I think you can remember, like, Pantheon was very early on in the year. We talked about Pantheon Varus Aphelios being one of the only decks to win, like, multiple events. And I'm going, you know, it's not super fair to count, like, Mordekaiser, Morgana, Elder Dragon, but, like, Morgana and Elder Dragon did win Worlds, so, like, it's actually just Mordekaiser. Get fucked, buddy. Freljord, not a great year. Ashe, Udyr, and Sejuani all failed to win events, and the ones that did make it, you know, you can kind of tell why, like, Lysandra Volibear were a pretty popular Titanic combination, Tryndamere Volibear were, like, a pretty popular, like, War Mothers combination, and, of course, Jax Ornn, gonna carry Ornn, and then Gnar just gets splashed in a lot through Bandle City and Freljord. But pretty expected stuff. Frostbite midrange did pretty well at the start of the year, but ultimately Ashe just never able to get the first place, always coming in second. Bilgewater, Nami, MF, Pyke, and Jack all did not make. Okay, so yeah, no scouts won. I knew Demacia Bilgewater was something else, because Misfortune did not actually win an event. Jack, obviously one of the biggest disappointments from the Glory and Navori season, given the dominance of Set and Samira throughout the year. Obviously, Lurk didn't win an event because it sucks. Nami, I was actually going through the old patch notes, and Nami getting changed to you've played 6+ spells with an allied Nami in play is actually listed under the buff section of the patch notes, which I wholeheartedly disagree with, but that's just something that I wanted to point out. So yeah, like Nautilus, Alawi, Neela, Fizz, all winning events. Not too surprising. Yeah, that's right, everybody. There was one deep win this year. So again, Bandle City, like I said, we're only counting Nora and Tristana. Everyone else we're counting for their secondary region, and Nora and Tristana did win events. So like, yeah, 2 out of 2 on Bandle City, but when we already know that like Heimerdinger is counted amongst these and did not win an event. So like, no region I would say actually had 100% victory rate. Bandle City, you know, kind of got the closest, I guess, if you just want to break it down the way that I did. But like 2 out of 2 is not really comparable to everybody else. Shadow Owl shit the bed. Look at this shit, man. We nerfed Red Gwen at the start of the year, so Gwen, you know, like Vayne Gwen didn't do it. By the time that the Fire Spitter decks were becoming popular, like Shadow Isle Fire Spitter was kind of moving out and more into like PNZ Fire Spitter. Callista hasn't had their time in the sun as like a Mordekaiser companion. Nocturne, we had some fearsome players going at it, but they didn't do it. So the winners are just Maokai and Vigar, and that Maokai is deep, not mill, and that Vigar is Nasus, not darkness, and that's why Senna didn't win an event either. But I'm sure that like Mordekaiser and Viego, they'll probably get in it next year. Gwen might as well. But it kind of depends on what happens with rotation, right? Then we talk about Demacia. Again, not counting Morgana as a Demacia champion because her win was in Targon. And Shyvana is actually the only champion in Demacia that did not pick up a win this year. Quinn, of course, getting splashed into the Aatrox lists. And Lucian, a pivotal part of Champion Strength Siren Song. I know there was a lot of debate when Lucian got changed from a 2-cost to a 1-cost about whether or not that was a buff. And then having it come up in a specific 1-drop meta, I don't really think settled that debate. But yeah, Lucian did get a win, as did Vayne, Garen, Quinn, Jarvan, Galio. In fact, Garen, Jarvan, Galio, I think, doing it all in the same list in Formidable. Vayne and Quinn doing it in the same list in Aatrox Vayne. So yeah, just a lot of camaraderie amongst the Demacia champions. Then we get into Ionia, where Ahri, Master Yi, and Shen failed to win events. Shen Jarvan never was an event-winning deck. Master Yi actually came close. There was one Wildfire win, but I believe it was Annie Zed. But Master Yi did make his way into a couple of the Wildfire lists, so, you know, he had his shot. He did have his top. But it was actually just Kennen, Zed, Karma, and Set that ended up winning events this year. Of course, Karma and Set together. Kennen getting thrown into the Bandle City Jinx sometimes. I believe that is where his win came from. And then Zed, I think, like I mentioned, was the Wildfire list. Then we get into Shurima. Oh, Shurima. Nidalee, Nasus, Taliyah, baby. That's it. Akshan, even in Eternal, Akshan was not able to get it done. There were a couple, like, Voltron-y Akshan lists where you just play, like Akshan Samira, right, where you have, like, 12 units and then, like, 20 buff spells and things like that. A true Voltron list, which is kind of why I changed the Voltron name to, like, PNZ Fire Spitter, Shadow Isle Fire Spitter. Azir just didn't get anything done, really didn't do much in Standard, and even when we go back to Eternal, just, like, was never the most broken thing you could be doing. Rek'Sai, obviously, Lurk sucks, so, like, not gonna happen. Kaisa got gutted at the start of the year, and Renekton, while we had that sort of cheesy, again, like, Voltron, like, Shurima just kind of became the Voltron-y region, where, like, Akshan decks were, like, Akshan Samira, where we play like 20 buff spells. There were like Renekton decks that played the landmark that gave Renekton +2/+1 in spell shield, and then just like 20 buff spells. And it was like, yeah, I hope I just draw Renekton and one-shot you. And even in the formats where we had Absolver, even in the Eternal formats, like these champions still were not winning those events. But yeah, Taliyah, Malphite, Ambush, Nasus, I think they all got one win, and that's Shurima for the year, baby. And actually, that's everybody for the year. And so wrapping it up, looking at it in a different way, this is where we'll take a look at Eternal again. We can actually look at the cost associated with a champion and then how they performed in Standard and Eternal. So 1-cost champions, every 1-cost champion in the game won an event this year. And I went back and checked, the only champions that did not top an event this year were Tahm Kench, Soraka. Everybody else got in at least once. But as far as winners go, because that's what this video is all about, 1 cost did very well. 2 costs, about 60% of them. 1 events, when we get into 3 costs, it was about half. 4 costs, again, like pretty close to half, maybe a little above. 5 costs, still just like a little above half. 6 costs, 4 out of 6, and then 7+. I believe it was just Aurelion Sol and Mordekaiser are the only ones that didn't win events on the 7+ cost. But yeah, I just thought this was a little interesting. And then you can see that of the Eternal champions, 57% of them won events this year, 65 out of 114, 55 out of 82 for Standard. So like, I would say that like 67% of our champions winning an event is probably a pretty good benchmark to set. I'm relatively happy with that because again, we are just looking at wins. We're not looking at second places. So I would say that, yeah, this is a pretty good metric to shoot for the Runeterra balance team going into the next year. And Eternal only 10 Eternal champions out of 32, which honestly, for only having 5 Eternal events this year, I would say that that's acceptable metrics. I don't think you can really expect to jam, 32 Eternal, like 32 Eternal champions literally could not have won, right? Because if we have 5 events, then okay, yeah, technically they could have. Technically they could have. But for the most part, I would say that like 10 is a reasonable metric. Like 33% of Eternal champions, yeah, that's like fine, right? Because of just how few events they have, because you still expect standard champions to like do something in Eternal and like have those cool older interactions and stuff like that. But this is just something, again, like I'm just picking out stats here, throwing them at you. But for me, this feels fine. One cost champions, all of them winning. I'm like, there's so few of them that it's like, okay, yeah, that's probably fine, right? And the fact that so many expensive champions won is also pretty cool as well. Yeah, ultimately, I'm pretty happy with the way that these stats shook out. 57 is pretty low for Eternal, but like 67 for Standard, I would say is pretty good. Like that's a pretty good amount of champions to have winning events. And finally, I believe this is the last graphic that I have, the best champions of 2023. So I tweeted earlier about how while Karma Set was the #1 deck, it was actually Seraphine that was the #1 champion. And then I went back and checked, and it was actually Samira. And Samira did it in a really cool way because of just the amount of unique decks that she had, which is why I overlooked it in the first place. There were 7 unique lists for Samira. 6 of these wins were the Plaza Guardian deck with Seraphine. 4 of them were Samira Fizz, but then there was 1 Invoke, 1 Noxus Leona, 1 Samira Janna, 1 Samira Varus, and 1 Samira Darius Nar. And then, you know, Seraphine only had the 2 decks. It was Pursuit Seraphine and Plaza Guardian Seraphine. Maybe you think it's unfair of me to lump those together like that, but, you know, is what it is. Jax tying with Seraphine, actually, thanks to Jax Varus timelines and Jax Orinal coming together. Set, you know, like we said, Karma Set, and then Seraphine Set. I know a lot of people like thought that Set was the big winner of the year because they saw like Pursuit Seraphine doing very well, but I think they forgot about the fact that it was like Boxer's Shadow Isle Seraphine and like that one Targon Seraphine that was running Karma Set in the same lineup, so he couldn't run Set. So Set actually didn't get too far beyond the Karma Set. But I think even with 2 decks, like, you're pretty happy with Set's representation for the year. Ornn, again, similar story to Jax, where it's like, it's Jax Ornn, and it's a little bit of timelines, and then boom, Ornn is still enough to make the top 5. And then I wanted to highlight Teemo, you know, someone not on any of the, like, higher represented decks here. Even when we looked at our top 8 lists, like, Elusive was at the bottom of the top 8 decks for the year, and only half of those were actually Teemo decks. One of them was Mono Zoe, one of them was Fizz Yumi. So Teemo had 5 different decks, and they were Puff Caps, Teemo Elise, Tristana Atrocity, Elusives, and Janna Champion Strength. So when we actually look at the best champion of the year, it was Samira, and she didn't like, she kind of stuck around a little bit longer than we thought she might, you know, even going into like Heart of the Huntress, she was still performing pretty well. She was still winning events. Like, that's where we had like that Samira Darius. That's where we had like I think the Samira Janna came there, the Invoke, you know, obviously happened in the Eternal format. And so, yeah, was she over nerfed? Maybe. But they kept coming and she kept winning. So I guess, you know, that is what it is. But that, I believe, actually does it for me in terms of stats. So I hope that you all enjoyed this year-end wrap-up. Congratulations to Samira and Piltover and Zon. And I sincerely hope that we don't get more of that next year. So, like, yeah, there were some outliers, but ultimately, I think I was pretty happy, actually, with how the year turned out and how the stats played out. I think that, like, 15 out of 37 wins, higher than I want for my #1 champion, but like not by too much. I think like 11's a pretty acceptable number, like 11, 12. I think like you really have to ask yourself, how many events in a year am I happy with the best champion of the year winning? Is 15 out of 37 good enough? Like, is that an acceptable metric? Because that's like, what is that, like 40 something percent? Because it's not half and it's not a third, it's a little bit in between. So I'm not mathing that out right now, but yeah, I would say that like Samira was a little strong. That's fine. Like, I think this is acceptable to me. 15 out of 37, that's for the best champion of the year. I'll take that, especially when we then like have a pretty hard fall off down to like 11 and 10. That's like, these feel like more acceptable numbers, and did it in 7 different decks, which I definitely not going to be mad about that. Flexed in a lot of different positions. So I like that. But yeah, that has been the year-end 2023 wrap up. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. I'm trying to do the YouTube thing a little bit harder now. So yeah, it helped me out if you could boost the algorithm a little bit when I do high effort videos like this. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.